Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim daf Pehei. Before we start, I'll just mention that we started our campaign for 2026 Circle of Friends. Our Circle of Friends was set up to really be able to help to fund all of the programming that we're doing, the daily daf yomi, the weekly shiurim that go up that I hope you're taking advantage of. We have teachers' high school project that we're helping to mentor and train teachers who are out in the field, and hopefully expanding to other things as well. We have an upcoming Siyum Hashas in a year and a half, so we highly suggest for those who can to help support Hadron Circle of Friends in any way you can. Any amount is really accepted, but it's $300 for the Circle of Friends specifically. It's $360 a year, about $1 a day for those who listen daily. So we're hoping that you can all join as usual, and all the details are on our site. You can find them on the homepage. You can also find it on the menu. And thank you. And if you want to give through a donor advised fund, there's details in the on the donation page about how to send checks or other methods. You can also reach out and ask me. Okay, with that, we will get started. I'll also just mention that on Hanukkah, starting from Tuesday to Monday, there will be no live class on Zoom. And because we now have a new setup with a new website, I can actually post them all in advance, and yet they'll appear as today's daf the morning of that day. At 7 a.m. Israel time, that day's daf goes up, but you can always access it both on the calendar, and you can go to next daf and you'll find them. They'll be up at some point by the beginning of next week. So if anybody wants to get ahead, and it's the same thing for the Shabbat daf. I've mentioned a few times, but in case you missed it, every Thursday afternoon, usually by then, the Shabbat daf is up, and you can always just get to it as the next page. Once it, you can always, when you look at the next page, usually you can't click on it because it's not up yet, but when it's up, you can actually get there. So it's a new system that we worked hard to get working and make it happen, to make it easier to post things in advance. And, it used to always be today's daf on Friday would be Shabbos' daf, which was always confusing. This is hopefully a better system. Okay, you just sometimes with new systems, you have to just get used to them and know how to use them. Okay, with that, we'll get started. Okay, I'll warn you, the first part of our daf, the very first part is not so complicated, but it's going to get a little complicated when we get to Ula. It's a bit of a long-winded section. I'll try to break it down so it makes it clear. And then the end part of the daf is fairly straightforward and jumps from topic to topic. That's kind of short. So Rabbi Yochanan, we're going to start off with a statement of Rabbi Yochanan, then a statement of Ula, then we're going to go back to Rabbi Yochanan. He's going to relate to something Ula said, perhaps a little slightly different. We'll get to that when we see it. Both of these issues that we're going to discuss in the beginning of class need some background. So the first topic is Rabbi Yochanan is talking about shchutei chutz, which is both shchutei chutz and ha'ala'at chutz. You're not allowed to slaughter sacrifices outside the Azara. Right? That has to happen in the Azara. We've learned that before, right? Whether it's north or not north, but it has to be in the Azara, that open courtyard that we've always talked about, right? You go in the Shar Nikanor, or the Nikanor gate, and there's that big open courtyard. Within it is the sanctuary and that closed building, right, which has that and the Kodesh Kodeshim. But in that open courtyard, that's where you do the slaughtering. If you do it outside, or you offer it outside, you're liable for doing that. But we're going to see later when we get to Daf Kuf Vav in the Mishnah that when you offer it outside, it has to be, for offering it outside, you get the punishment as long as the slaughtering was done in a mostly proper manner. Okay, and it's a little murky waters there. Like, for example, there's a big exception to the rule, which is, well, if you both slaughter it outside, which is obviously not, the slaughtering wasn't done properly, and you offer it outside, you will get karet. That's an exception to the rule, and that's what you need to know for right now. So Rabbi Yochanan comes and says, and this is all related to our Mishnah, because our Mishnah listed a whole bunch of different disqualified cases. And if you remember, there was a machlokah between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon about nishchat b'layla, right? And now, by the way, the criteria there for it being a shchita that's mostly kosher is if the shchita was done that way and you put it on the altar, would it have to come off the altar? Okay, if it would have to come off the altar, that's not a good slaughtering. And then offering it outside the temple would actually not be, you would be liable because the shechita was so off. Okay? But there's this, Rabbi Yochanan comes and says, even though Rabbi Yehuda says, Nishchat b'layla, imalu, yerdu, you would have to take it off the altar, which would then mean that offering it outside the temple, let's say you slaughtered it at night, and then offered it outside on an altar outside the temple, you wouldn't be liable, because according to Rabbi Yehuda, that's in the category of, if it went on the altar, you would actually take it off the altar. So it's so disqualified. So you would think that therefore, if you slaughtered it out at nighttime, which is a big disqualification, according to Rabbi Yehuda anyway, and then offered it on the altar outside, you wouldn't be liable, because it's a bit very disqualified shechita. But comes Rabbi Yochanan and says, if you did it inside, but at night, which we just said is a major problem, if you offered it outside, you'd actually be liable. I forgot to mention, we're reading from the bottom of Pei Dalet. Okay, we now just finished Pei Dalet Amud Bet. You would be liable. Why would you be liable? Well, he makes a logical argument. He says, now I did mention to you this before, what if you slaughtered outside and you offered it outside, you'd be liable? So he says, slaughtering it inside at night cannot be any worse than slaughtering it outside. Slaughtering it outside is a big no-no, right? Slaughtering it inside, well, you're inside. Now, it is night. You're not supposed to do it at night. But that can't be worse than slaughtering it outside. So, lo te pchuta could be no worse than mishochet b'chutz u'ma'aleh b'chutz. And since shochet b'chutz u'ma'aleh b'chutz you're chayav, then slaughtering it inside at night, you should also be liable. That's his logic. Mativ Rav Chiya bar Avin. Rav Chiya bar Avin is going to try to go against this logic from a case of a bird. And this is in the Mishnah in Daf Kuf Yud Aleph. Hashochet of bifnim ve'he'ela b'chutz patur. If you slaughter a bird inside, okay, now already something should be ringing in your head. Remember, you're not allowed to slaughter birds. You have to do melika in the temple, right? Remember, slaughtering is for outside the temple, which is equal to melika inside the temple. But you can't do slaughtering of a bird in the temple. So if you slaughter a bird inside, and then he'ela b'chutz, and you offer it outside, you're patur. You're exempt. And yet, shachat b'chutz, if you slaughter the bird outside, ve'he'ela b'chutz, you'd be chayav. If you slaughtered it outside and offered it outside, you'd actually be liable. Now, wouldn't you say that slaughtering it inside can't be worse than slaughtering it outside? Right? Same idea. And yet, you're exempt if you slaughter it inside. And you're not exempt if you slaughter it, and you're liable if you slaughter it outside. So that comparison that he tried to make doesn't really hold when it comes to the birds, so he wants to reject the logic of Rabbi Yehuda when it comes to animals. So again, he says, it should be no worse than, right? Slaughtering it inside should definitely be no worse than slaughtering it outside. So, two possible answers. One is tiyuvta. This actually is a knockout to Rabbi Yochanan. However, but a possible way to answer it is that shechita inside of a bird is like murdering a bird, because it's not a kosher shechita. In the temple, you need melika. And that's why it's so bad that if you then offer the sacrifice and burn it outside, or do the blood outside, you're not going to be liable, because the shechita was so bad, because the shechita wasn't shechita at all. It was, right, you're supposed to do melika, and you did shechita. That's why, okay? And then that has nothing to do with slaughtering an animal at night. That's a different kind of thing. And then you really maybe could learn Rabbi Yochanan's halacha. So that we have Rabbi Yochanan's halacha, a difficulty on it, and then two possible responses. Either really he's knocked out, or perhaps there's a good way to answer this question by distinguishing between slaughtering of a bird and slaughtering of animals, which makes sense. Amar Ula. Now Ula comes along. Now, Ula's halacha was going to be also based on some stuff we need to understand before, which is difference between kodshe kodshim and kodshim kalim. There's a lot of differences, but one of the main differences is that kodshe kodshim, once you slaughter it, already it's sanctified, and there's a law of me'ilah. Me'ilah is, right, misuse of consecrated property. This is sanctified. Kedushat haguf, okay, it's fully sanctified, all the parts of it. Then what happens? When you sprinkle the blood, you remove me'ilah from the parts that now the Kohen can eat. So it starts off being all sanctified, and with the laws of me'ilah, which is misuse of consecrated property. And then as it goes on and the blood is sprinkled, poured or thrown, whatever it might be, that removes, at least in an ola, it never gets removed. Everything is me'ilah. except for the hide, which then goes to the Kohanim. But if it's chatat, for example, sin offering, the meat, then the whole prohibition of using consecrated property, right, gets removed off of that. Okay. Kachim kalim works the opposite. Kachim kalim is things like the Pesach, shlamim, which the owner gets to eat the meat. There's really no me'ila until what point? Until you sprinkle the blood on the altar. At the moment you sprinkle the blood on the altar, all of a sudden we start to break this, just like we break the animal into parts in the kodesh kodeshim to remove sanctity. We're now going to do the reverse here. At the sprinkling of the blood, what happens? You are now obligated, you weren't before, because you just had an animal and the whole animal was, going to be used for that owner, for their sacrifice, and ultimately will be eaten by them. But once you sprinkle the blood, we now start distinguishing between the imurim, which are the fatty parts that are going to get burnt on the altar, and the rest of it. So the rest of it is going to remain in its status of no me'ila, but the imurim, those parts, are going to now have a law of me'ila, and you can't use them. There's misuse of consecrated property for them, and they're going to have to be burnt on the altar. They're not burnt on the altar, obviously, before the blood is sprinkled. Before the blood is sprinkled, this is one whole animal that basically is for the use of the owner. And then only once you slaughter and then sprinkle the blood are the imurim supposed to go on the altar. What if you did it in the reverse order? So comes Ula and he says, Amar Ula, Imurei kochim kalim shehelan lifnei zrikat damam. What if you took these kochim kalim? You took the imurim, the parts, the fatty parts are supposed to be burned, and you put them on the altar before the blood was supposed to be sprinkled. So now, here comes the issue. The issue that we've been discussing is, do you have to take them off the altar because they don't belong? Or do we say, lo yerdu? And he says, lo yerdu. Why? Na'asu lachmo shel mizbeach. They became the bread of the altar. We saw this term once before. It's another term that they use for talking about why this law of lo yerdu, not supposed to be taken off, because as we talked about this yesterday, right, and I mentioned that in Din and Daf this week, it was all about this topic, which is a very interesting topic, how this works, this whole thing that once you put it on, well, you're not supposed to put it, but once you put it, it's there. So one of these ideas is that the Mizbeach sort of just accepts it and sanctifies it. So even though it wasn't sanctified before, right, well, since ultimately, once the blood is sprinkled, this will be sanctified, so we're going to say it's already sanctified and can go on and can be left on the altar. Again, don't put it there, ideally. But once it's there, it can be absorbed by the Mizbeach. Right? It literally becomes the bread of the Mizbeach and things that belong there, even though it didn't really belong there before because it wasn't sanctified at all. Right? You understand the connection of Me'ila is the negative, right? If you misuse it because it's consecrated. If there's no me'ila, it means it's not consecrated. So it means it wasn't consecrated. You shouldn't put non-consecrated things on the altar. So now, okay, I see you're asking, you can't eat it anymore. This isn't the parts you're supposed to eat. These are the parts that are supposed to be burned. You just burned them too early. Okay, you burned them before they were ready to be burned. So that's the idea. These aren't the parts, we're not talking about the parts that are supposed to be eaten by people. We're just talking about, you put the parts there anyway supposed to go on the altar. The chaylev, remember all that chaylev that goes on the altar? So you put that part on the altar, the shtei klayot and all that. You put them on the altar before they were sanctified. That's the idea. So he says, it's fine. The Mizbeach kind of takes them in. Now what we're going to try to do, Rabbi Zera is going to come along and say, I can prove this from our Mishnah, and it's going to be a little similar to Rabbi Yochanan, because we're going to say, well, we're going to prove it from some logical inference from the Mishnah, from the Braita. Okay, we'll see. He could have quoted this from the Mishnah. He seems to be quoting it from the Braita, and we're going to see in the continuation why it's from the Braita. You might remember, let's just remind you, yesterday we had a Mishnah which talked about all these cases that if you put them on the altar, they stay or not, okay? And there was this distinction between cases that go and don't go. Then we had a Braita, which had the same distinction. There was also the Machlok of Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda, which I referenced already today. Also in the Mishnah, and the Braita went to, their drashot, where Rabbi Yehuda gets it from, the three miyutim, where Rabbi Shimon gets it from. And then it went and it gave you a more expanded list, if you remember, of which things are, already there. We're going to call them Psulo B'Kodesh, and they would stay on the altar. So it had a more expanded list. So now comes Rabbi Zera and says, Af ananami tanina. We can learn this from the Mishnah. Shenishpach dama, v'sheyatza dama chutz l'kleim. In one of the cases there, which at least according to Rabbi Shimon, imalu lo yirdu, if you put it on, you wouldn't take it off. If the blood spilled, or the blood left the Azara. Now, if the blood spills or leaves the Azara, then you put it on the altar. What are we talking about you put on the altar? Well, it could be the imurim, right? It could be the imurim like we're talking about. Now, if the blood spilled and you put the imurim on the altar, we're going to leave them on there. That's what the Braita is saying. Uma hatam. Now, why is, if that case you could leave it on the altar, then obviously our case you could leave it on the altar. Why? Because what happened there that didn't happen here? Hatam de imba lizrok ein lo lizrok. If you want to sprinkle the blood, and it's what happened there. The blood spilled. You put the imurim anyway on the altar. We don't take them off. Well, you never sprinkled the blood there, and not only did you not sprinkle the blood, but you can never sprinkle the blood because the blood spilled. You don't have the blood anymore. Or the blood was taken out and it's disqualified. And yet, if you put the imurim on the altar, they will stay. That's what the Braita is telling you. So amarta imalu lo yirdu. If you put it on lo yirdu. So hacha, in our case, you're talking about not a case where the blood was disqualified. You're talking about a case where you just did it too early. You put the imurim before the blood. Eventually, you're going to put the blood on the altar. And even if you don't, you can, right? Whereas if the blood spilled, you can't. Or if the blood got disqualified, you can't. So hacha imbal lizrok zorek lo kol shekin. Imbal lizrok zorek. If you wanted to sprinkle the blood, you could. So lo kol shekin, all the more so if you put the imurim on, you won't take them off. So that sounds like a pretty clear proof, right? Rabbi Zera says from there, if you never put the blood and you can't ever put the blood and yet you put the imurim, we're not going to take them off. So in a case like ours where you didn't put the blood yet, but you still can, of course if you put the imurim on, we should leave them on. Sounds like a very good proof. But the Gemara is going to reject this proof and claim Tirgama a koche kochim. How do you know the Braita is talking about koche kochim kalim? Maybe it's talking about koche kochim because again, what's the difference koche kochim kalim? Koche kochim from the beginning it's sanctified. The whole thing is sanctified because the whole thing really belongs to the altar until you sprinkle the blood, and then some of the meat's going to be permitted. But the rest of it, right, is all sanctified from the beginning, and the imurim are going to ultimately be burned. They're always on a track of kedusha from the beginning. So if you're talking about koche kochim, it makes sense. If you put them on, you don't take them off. But if that Braita is not talking about kochim kalim, then we can't learn anything to our case because kochim kalim are completely different. And basically what they're going to try to claim, and this is going to be a long-winded thing because what we're going to do is we're going to basically, I'll tell you the structure and hopefully this will help you. First, Rabbi Zera tried to prove what Ula said from the Mishnah, with the Braita. We're going to reject that, and we're going to question the rejection and resolve it. Then we're going to try to do the same thing from the Mishnah, okay? From a different line in the Mishnah, okay? A different way of getting it from the Mishnah. So first they say, wait, how could you say that the Braita is talking about kochim only when the Braita, and this is why it's clear they're quoting it from the Braita, because later on in the Braita, as I told you, the Braita gave a lot more cases, and one of the cases they brought was Pesach sheshachatan shelo lishma. Right? A Pesach, now Pesach is kochim kalim. So you can't say the whole Braita is talking about kochim when it's talking about kochim kalim also. One of the cases is kochim kalim. So wouldn't that prove that it's talking about kochim kalim? To which they answer, right? So hare Pesach, the kochim kalim who? So you can't say the Braita is only talking about kochim. You say, no, tirgama b'shelo lishma. That case of Pesach was really brought there for a very specific case of shelo lishma. They wanted you to know, since the Pesach shelo lishma is disqualified, still, if you put it on the altar, and theoretically you could say, even after the blood was spilled. Okay, let's say you did a Pesach shelo lishma, sprinkled the blood, and then it wouldn't be a case like this where it was all brought before. So we're basically going to say, don't ask from Pesach, because that's on a different track and a totally different kind of case, and there's nothing to do with what we're talking about here of all the general cases, and if the blood, specifically, if the blood was spilled. Okay, so we've resolved that question, but just so you remember where we're going. Rabbi Zera tried to prove Ula from the Braita, and we rejected it because we basically say the Braita is only talking about koche kochim. Okay, and even though we tried to say, well, what about Pesach? We can neutralize that and say that was a unique case with a unique perspective, and that had nothing to do with blood spilling or anything. That could be after the blood was already spilled, and that's why the imurim were already sanctified, and that's why they could go on the altar. So that's not a question. Tanan. Here comes another attempt to prove. So We resolved, just to be clear, we resolved a question on the rejection of the proof. Okay? In the end, we're left with the proof is rejected. Second attempt to prove. Tnan. V'kulan she'alu chayim l'gabei mizbeach yirdu. Now we're quoting one of the end of the Mishnah, where it said all these cases, if you brought them up on the altar when they were still alive, you would take them down. Okay? The animals, when we say they're sanctified, it's after they've already been slaughtered, but before they've been slaughtered, you'd take them off. Hashchutim. Now, here we're going to go. It's not really from what it says in the Mishnah. It's from an inference in the Mishnah. What's the inference? Well, it says all of these, if you brought them up alive, you would take them down, which sounds like hashchutim, if they were slaughtered, lo yerdu. And then, right, all those psulim before, including the blood being sprinkled, all those cases, if they were slaughtered, you wouldn't take them off. Now, the assumption being, just like before, we're doing the same type of rejection same type of proof, and then we're going to have the same type of rejection of the proof. My love, loshna koche koche v'loshna kochim kalim. It sounds like all animals who were slaughtered with, if the blood spilled or all that, and that happened, and you put the parts on the altar, they would stay. And that, because again, it said if they went alive, no, but it sounds like if they were slaughtered, and it doesn't make any distinction what level sanctity, sounds like they would all stay. So that would again prove what Ula was saying. To which they say, no. Okay, that's not the proper inference. Just because it said all of these, if they were alive, they would go down, doesn't mean that all of these, if they were slaughtered, would stay on. Okay? Lo, hashchutim, you could say. No, but from there infer, if they were shchutim, well, if they were slaughtered, there's two tracks. Mehen yerdu, mehen lo yerdu. Some of the slaughtered ones will go down, will be taken off, and some of them will stay. Vaha, okay, so now they say, right, meaning, okay, let's just spell it out. If they're koche kochim, since they were already sanctified before the blood spilled, they'll stay on. And if they're kochim kalim, since they weren't sanctified before the blood spilled, then they don't stay on because they don't even have sanctity to them. So just take them right off the altar. And then that rejects what Ula said. The Gemara says, Vahakulan katane, but it says all of them, which means all of them, if they're alive, go off, which would then infer all of them slaughtered would stay on. So they say, no, kulam achayim. No. What they really mean is just all of them who are alive. And they really forget any inference. They're not trying to come and tell you what it is about all the cases if they're slaughtered. Again, some yes, some not, depending koche kalim. Again, this is all to reject Ula. And kulam, that word, all of them, is just referring to what it says. All of them who are alive come down. To which the Gemara says, pshita, obviously if they're all alive, they come down. Why if they're all alive? Because all alive hasn't been sanctified at all yet. So they say no. Lo olam achayin ubedukin sheba'ayin. It's really trying to tell you just about the live animals. And don't think it's pshita and obvious, because here's really what that line was coming to tell you. Okay, that line wasn't coming to tell you about, an animal that was fine and then the blood spilled, or an animal that was, well, the truth is it can't be the blood spilled. That's not a good one, right? Because that obviously wouldn't have been alive. But if they're alive, what they want to tell you is they're talking about Bidugin Sheba'ayin Va'aliba de Rabbi Kiva Damar Imalu Lo Yerdu. What it wants to tell you is all of them is really trying to say, well, one of the things in the list there of if they went up, they don't come down, was specifically Rabbi Akiva, who disagreed with the general position. And Rabbi Akiva said, a Balmum, which later we're going to see today, finally that quote, but we've seen it a bunch of times already, that if there's a problem with the eye, a dukin shaba'ayin, which could be a problem with the cornea, could be some other sort of issue, some sort of issue with the eye, that kind of disqualification is actually allowed on the altar. And what they're trying to say in this line, when it says specifically, even an animal that has a blemish of dukin shaba'ayin, even though it's a minor blemish according to Rabbi Akiva, okay, and according to Rabbi Akiva this can be accepted. We're going to see why specifically he talks about that case. We're going to see that later today. I will give away, but specifically it's talking about that case, and Aliba de Rabbi Akiva Mario Malulo Yerdu, and it's telling you that animal, even though Rabbi Akiva says Imalulo Yerdu, it's only after it's slaughtered. If it went up on the altar before while it was still alive, we take it down. Okay, that's the chiddush of that line. And then no inference about slaughtered, right? And then we can ignore this as being a proof. This line does not serve as a proof at all. So now the Gemara says, wait a minute. That's what you're trying to say this line is coming to say about psulim? Psulim? You're going to say that this is talking about psulim. Now again, I want to just remind you where we're up to in the flow. We tried to prove ula from the Braita. And then we said, right, assuming the Braita was talking about kocha kal. We said, oh no, the Braita's only talking about kocha, and this has nothing to do with ula. Then we tried to prove it from the Mishnah. And then we said, the Mishnah has nothing to do with kocha kal, because the Mishnah wasn't even talking about shchutim, it was talking about the ones alive, right? We tried to take that one line. We tried to infer from that line that all cases of live animals come down, meaning all cases of slaughtered stay up, even kochim kalib, even if the imurim were put on before the blood, right? All those cases. But then we said, no, that's not what it's talking about. That line is really talking only about live animals. And then you say, well, there's no chiddush. Oh no, the chiddush is, even if they're disqualified with just a minor disqualification, the Rabbi Akiva doesn't even think is a disqualification, we're still going to take it off. We can't leave it on the altar. So now, I was going to say, wait a minute. You want to say at the end of the Mishnah there was all talking about psulim, but we're going to ask two difficulties to this. Now again, there's a difficulty on the rejection of the proof. Okay? In the end, we're going to be left with the rejection of the proof. Okay? That's what we're going to be left with. So just so you follow. So right now we're questioning this rejection of the proof, that you can't use the Mishnah as a proof because we're trying to say the whole chidush is about psulim, but wait, can't say the Mishnah is talking about psulim, and we're going to have two parts to this question. The first is going to be ema seifa. Look at the next line after that one. So the Mishnah, if you go back again, so the Mishnah on Daf Pei Daled says, V'kulam im, right, if they're shalu chayim l'rosh mizbeach yirdu. And then there was this bit of a strange line because it seemed like a continuation, but all of a sudden they start getting into the ola. They give an example of an ola. It's supposed to be completely burnt, that went up alta chaya l'rosh mizbeach while it was alive, tered. Which kind of sounds like it's saying the same thing. But they want to add this point apparently, shchatan b'rosh mizbeach, if you ended up though slaughtering at the top of the mizbeach, the slaughter is valid because you can slaughter things on the top of the mizbeach even though you shouldn't. And yafshif yinetachah bimkoma. And then you do what you always do in an ola. You do have shef v'nituach. You first take off the hide because the hide's going to go to the kohanim. It's the only part of the ola that can go to the kohanim. And the rest of it gets chopped up into pieces because you're going to burn the parts in pieces. You burn the ola in parts. You chop it up. Okay, so now, ema seifa, look at the end. Now, you're going to say this time about psuli. What's the problem? Well, it says, v'chein ola shal tachaya. We assume if the line about the animals going up alive is about disqualified animals, which we just said, then the rest of it's going to have to be about disqualified animals. Now, it says, v'chein ola shal ta rosh mizbeach tered. Shchata b'rosh mizbeach yafshif yinitach b'mkoma, as I just read. V'i psula, bat of shef v'nituachi. If it's disqualified, why are you taking off the hide and why are you cutting it into parts? You're not going to burn it on the altar. It's disqualified. V'nitach, and how do we know that you can't, in case maybe you thought you can? V'nitach otam arachmana ota k'sherav psula. Cut it. It means it being when it's kosher, not when it's disqualified. Okay, so how are you going to explain that? That can't be talking about disqualified animal. So they say, seifa atan l'kshera, umay kamash malan, diyesh hafshev v'nituach b'rosh hamizbech. They say, the first line there, like I said, it's a little strange. First we said alive animals, and then we said an ola that's alive. So they say, the pasuk, the sentence about live animals is talking about disqualified live animals. Don't take that, right? You have to take them off, even if it's just a mild disqualification of dukan shaba'ayin. Then the next line, the ola, is talking about if it's a kosher animal that you brought up alive, okay? But you're not supposed to bring it up alive and do the slaughtering up at the top. Take it down, but if you slaughtered it, you can do that shef v'nituach at the top of the altar. And that's what it's trying to teach you, that shef v'nituach could be done at the top of the altar. Okay? Now, so now they say, so wait, I read it a little bit wrong because what they're saying is seifa atan l'kshera. Okay, let's stop there for a minute. So the seifa is coming for a kosher animal. So the Gemara kind of asked this though, umay kamash malan, diyesh shef v'nituach b'rosh mizbech. Well, what's it coming to teach you then? It's coming to teach you that you can do hafshef v'nituach at the top of the altar. Now, this happens to be a subject of debate because of a different issue. There's a lot of issues today that we haven't learned about, so it's a lot of new things. part of what makes the stuff complicated. Hefshei v'nituach has to be done before you burn the parts on the altar. Makes sense, right? Okay, obviously you're going to cut it into parts before you burn them. But some people say that by bringing something up to the top of the altar, it's as if you started the process of burning it already, even though you didn't. You didn't put it on the fire. But because the Mizbeach is the place where the fire is, by putting it on the top, it's as if you started it. It even goes sort of hand in hand with this, imala lo yered, like, so what if it got to the altar, right? But it's almost as if it was already absorbed by the Mizbeach, and as if it was already started the burning process. So they kind of go hand in hand a little bit. So some people say, since you already brought it up to the top of the altar, it's as if you started the process of burning, you can no longer do Hefshei v'nituach because you missed your chance. Okay, so some people say you can't do that. And what this is coming to tell you is you could. We don't view it that way. Okay, we're on the side of Hefshei v'nituach. That's what our Mishnah is telling us. Okay, Laman damar ein Hefshei v'nituach b'rosh mizbeach ma'yikal amemar. But if you hold there is no Hefshei v'nituach, how are you going to explain our Mishnah? Well, we have another way to explain it. Hacha b'mayaskina kigon shayta lo shata kosher v'nifsala. We could actually say it's talking about a disqualified animal, and what it's telling you is that if it was able to be, if it was had some point where it wasn't disqualified, and then only became disqualified after, then you could still do it. You could do that Hefshei v'nituach. For Elazar Rabbi Shimon, he da'amal, kevan shenitzrak adam v'urtza basal sha'a achat, yafshitena ve'ora lekohanim. It's really the Hefshei part more than the nituach. The Hefshei part is giving the hide to the kohanim. Now, once a korban is disqualified, you might have thought the hide doesn't go to the kohanim. And what this is telling you, again, this is another track of how to understand this Mishnah. Again, all this is within that we're not making any inference about slaughtered animals. This is only talking about live animals. What it wants to teach you is disqualified live animals also come down, even though it's a mild disqualification of dukin shaba'ayin. And then it's telling you the next line is actually talking about ksherim, and it's talking about that you could do Hefshei v'nituach at the top of the altar. So there's two different things going on at the end of this Mishnah. One is psulim and one is ksherim. Or you can read it that it's all talking about psulim, and what it's saying is if you brought your olah up and it got disqualified at the top, and at some point it was able to be slaughtered, then and everything was able to be done, but then it got disqualified, then you would actually do the Hefshei because you would take the hide off, and that would go to the kohanim still. And that's what it's talking about. And again, this has nothing to do then with slaughtering. It has nothing to do then with kodshim kalim or anything. Anything having to do with anything. Okay, so we resolved question number one, which was that line, which sounded like, the ola shalta chaya l'rosh mizbeach tered, and then shachata yafshifi yinateach could be talking about either ksherim or maybe psulim, but either which way we could still understand the sentence before as psulim. But now they say, wait a minute. Ela dekatani ketzad osa. Morid et hakravayim lamata umedichan. But there's another line on this Mishnah that's going to make it hard to say that we're talking about psulim, because it's talking about disqualified animals. It says there's a breita on our Mishnah. It's not on our Mishnah, but it's a breita that kind of is the next step after our Mishnah. It says, so what do? Let's say you did the Hefshei v'nituach at the top. So morid et hakravayim lamata umedichan. You take down the parts of the animal, the innards, and they're full. What's the problem? They might be full of feces inside. So you want to take them out before you offer them on the altar. So you take them down, you clean out the insides of them, take out all the feces. So lamali. Why would you be doing that if they're disqualified? Because what happens? If they go up, then right, they stay on. But if they came down, you don't put them back up. So hechin yavid. Okay, so they say, first of all, why are you washing them? I'll tell you why we're washing them. It's obvious. Hechin yavid yakrinu b'partayu. What you're going to offer it with the feces inside. You're not going to bring something disgusting to God. Is God going to want your gift? That's a pasuk, right? Obviously, you're not going to bring something disgusting. They say, no. This is what we're asking. Midichan lamali, and Rashi adds the words here, very importantly, if we're talking about disqualify, which is the second explanation we just gave in the previous section, well, if you took them down, you're not supposed, right? Once they're on, we say we can leave them. But once you take them down, you don't put them back up. So you took them off the altar after you did the Hefshei v'nituach, and now you're not going to bring them back up and offer them. So why on earth would you be rinsing them, right? Which seems to be very clear. They're talking about kosher animals and not ones that are disqualified. And that's why you're washing them. So no, we can still come up with an example where it's disqualified, and we're not going to bring it back up, but we're still going to wash them out. Why? Okay, we've been in this Masechet long enough to know that there was sometimes, or at least there was always concern for confusion in the temple, and you could see why this would happen. Maybe a Kohen will walk by, see the parts, think that they're supposed to go on the altar, bring them up to the altar, and then they'll have feces inside. That's why you should wash them out, just in case someone accidentally doesn't realize these are disqualified parts that aren't supposed to go on the altar, and they bring them up, and they put them up. Okay, turning now to Amud Bet. They say, wait a minute. You're actually going to help a Kohen, like you're going to clean it out so that if somebody comes along and offers it up incorrectly, at least there'll be something right about it. Like we're creating a situation where now that it's cleaned out, the Kohen will all the more so see it's cleaned out and think, oh, I should bring this up to the altar. This must be a good sacrifice. So how can we do that? To which they answer, we're going to finally done with this long-winded whole section, we don't want kodshe shamayim like thrown away like dead animals, thrown aside like dead animals. In other words, we're being pulled, right? We don't want, in the end, we have two issues here. Number one, we don't want the Kohen to put disqualified parts on the altar. But number two, if they are to do it, we don't want them to be disgusting and offered to God with the feces inside. So on the one hand, we don't want disqualified offerings being offered to God. And on the other hand, if they are going to be offered, we want them cleaned out. So in the end, what wins out in that battle of what would we prefer, better to have them cleaned out and not have something burning to God that has feces inside. And at least it'll be disqualified, but at least it won't be disqualified with feces inside. Okay? So we'd rather avoid that issue, and that's why we clean them out. Again, it's a bit of a stretch. The obvious, simple reading is they're cleaned out because they're going to go back on the altar and that we're not talking about disqualified animals at all, right? That's the more simple reading. But this was all an attempt to try to say you can't necessarily prove Ula from there. If it was all kosher animals, then you actually could prove Ula, because then we'd be saying it's all, you could infer from there that the whole inference would then work. If they're kosher animals, there's no real chiddush. If they're alive, take them down. And then you would basically say the inference is if they're slaughtered, then they can all stay on, even kochim kalim, and that would prove Ula. But this was all an attempt to say, no, that's not what it's talking about. The chiddush is that they're disqualified, and even though it's disqualified, according to Rabbi Akiva, it would be accepted, but only once it's slaughtered, not when it's alive. And again, it was a very long-winded argument, but if we summarize this whole section, and we'll summarize Rabbi Yochanan at this point also, Rabbi Yochanan had a logical argument to prove his halacha, and Rav Chiya bar Avin tried to knock it off with the issue of the shchita da'of, which we perhaps resolved, perhaps didn't. Then Ula brings this halacha, and we try to prove it. First, Rabbi Zevachim tried to prove it from the Braita. Then we tried to prove it from the Mishnah. But both times we say, who's to say those sources are talking about kochim kalim and our topic? And maybe they're not at all, and then this has nothing to do with Ula, and you can't prove anything. Okay. Now we're going to continue a little bit in the vein of Ula, because you're going to see, but we're done with the complicated part. Now we're just going to jump small sugyas till we get to the end of the daf. Amar Rabbi Chiya bar Abba by Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Chiya bar Abba says that Rabbi Yochanan asked the following question. And then he's going to basically ask the question of what Ula told us. Okay, but he's asking it as a question. It's not obvious to him at first. Imurei kochim kalim she'alan lifnei zrikat haman yirdu o lo yirdu. Okay, exactly what Ula said. If you bring the imurim of the kochim kalim before the blood is sprinkled, before they're sanctified, you put them on the altar. Do you take them off or not? He didn't know. Amalei Rabbi Ami. But now we're going to go off on a bit of a different direction. Rabbi Ami says to him, "V'tibayalach me'ilah." Why don't you ask, is there me'ilah or not? So Amalei me'ilah lo kamebayla. I didn't ask, is there me'ilah, a prohibition of misuse of consecrated property, because dizriku de kavale b'me'ilah. I know that me'ilah only kicks in. This is where I started with this whole section. Me'ilah, I know it only kicks in when you sprinkle the blood. So if the blood was never sprinkled, for sure there's no me'ilah. But my question is, kika mebayla yirida. But what I want to know is, well, since there's no me'ilah, maybe it's not consecrated at all, and therefore maybe I should take it down. Or maybe not. Upashid, in the end, he answers, lo yirdu ve'en b'hem me'ilah. He answers like Rish Lakish, which is, we don't take them down. Even though I know there's no me'ilah, but still, the whole question here is when it's not consecrated, right? You would think maybe the Mizbeach couldn't absorb it really, but it does anyway, okay? Because ultimately it's supposed to go on, okay? That's what his whole proof was, right? If when the blood spills, we let it, right? We leave it. So also here. Again, maybe that wasn't an inference from the Mishnah, because maybe the Mishnah was only talking about Kochim. But that was what Ula tried to say, and apparently Rabbi Yochanan agrees. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak matnei hachi. Right? It's interesting to see that Rabbi Yochanan goes in the same vein as Ula, and yet the Gemara struggled so much to try to disprove all the proofs for Ula. It almost sounds like the Gemara is against Ula, but yet Rabbi Yochanan is definitely on his side. Rav Nachman bar, that's always a question of the organization of the sugya. Like, why is the sugya trying so hard to disprove? Right? Sometimes they try to disprove things that actually are true. It's just they're dealing with it a lot because, anyways. So again, they're not trying to disprove, and they're just knocking out any proof that he has from these sources. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak had a different version of this sugya. That Amar Rav Chiya bar Abba by Rabbi Yochanan. The Rabbi Yochanan's question was this: his question was about me'ilah. He asked, if you put them on the altar, maybe at that point the me'ilah clock starts ticking. Maybe it actually becomes consecrated to the extent that you're now prohibited if you accidentally use it for your own purpose. And that was his question. Amar le Rabbi Ami, and then Rabbi Ami said to him, instead of saying, why don't you ask about me'ilah, since he asked about me'ilah, he said, v'tibai lach yirida, why don't you ask, you have to take it down. Okay, so the other issue. Amar le yirida lo kamit ba'ile, d'nasolach moshe mizbech. And then what was obvious to him is, obviously you don't take it down. Okay, what Ula had said to him was completely obvious. It wasn't even a question. Ki kamit ba'ile me'ilah, but what I wanted to know is maybe me'ilah actually kicks in as well. Upashit hachi, and then he answers. The bottom line is the same according to both versions. Lo yirdu ve'em behem me'ilah. They don't come down. However, there is no me'ilah. Okay, so we're at this in between. On the one hand, the mizbeach kind of takes it under its wing, but it still isn't one of these things that is sanctified to the extent that if you would misuse it, right, use it for your own individual purpose, you'd be liable. It's not in that category. Okay. Now we're moving to the next line in the Mishnah. Another line in the Mishnah. Ilu lo haya psulam b'kodesh, and then we basically want to get to this baalei mumim. We're finally going to see the dukan shabayin that we keep on quoting. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, because remember, Rabbi Yehuda just said baalei mumim or imalu lo yerdu. You don't take them off, as opposed to Tanakh who said you do. Rabbi Yochanan said, okay, don't think Rabbi Yehuda is talking about serious blemishes like missing a leg. But lo ichshir Rabbi Yehuda ela b'dukan shabayin, and obviously it doesn't mean only dukan shabayin, but things that are like it. Because if you remember, ofot don't really have blemishes. The only kind of blemishes they have if they're completely missing a limb or something serious like that. So, okay, so that's the kinds he's talking about because they're not found in ofot. Now remember this, because there's no problem in ofot, we're going to say it's not a problem in animals. Again, it's a problem in animals, but if you put it up there, we're going to leave it on there. Keep that in your head for the next sugya. Vehu shekadam hekdeshan et mumam. But this is only if first you sanctified it, then it got the blemish. But if it was blemished before you even sanctified the animal, then we're not going to let it on the altar if you accidentally put it on there. Umodi Rabbi Akiva ba'olat nekeva. Now, what if you took a female animal for your ola, which is not allowed? You could only use male animals for an ola. Ola has to come from male animals. If you designated a female animal for a burnt offering, and you brought it on the altar after it was slaughtered, you would not leave it on there because that's like, what more blemishes than that you brought the wrong type of animal. Okay, by Rabbi Yirmiyah. Okay, don't forget all of Rabbi Yirmiyah's questions. Get ready for this one. Yesh nirba ba'ofot or ein nirba ba'ofot? Now, nirba and rovea, what's the difference? Rovea is where the animal initiates, and nirba is where the person initiates bestiality. So now, what if you have, okay, this isn't a beast, this isn't a bird. Well, apparently, well, the sugya is assuming I can't talk about reality, and I saw some footnote, but I don't understand enough to be talking about it. So anyway, we're going to go with just accept it. Also, we don't have a lot of time. Birds cannot initiate engaging in sexual relations with a human. Okay, perhaps because of the way their sexual organs are, or whatever you would call them by birds. So there isn't that, but there can be nirba where a human can initiate. So is nirba a disqualification if it happened to the bird in birds or not? Mi amrina, here are the two sides. Mina bema comes to say you have to bring the animal from, you have to bring it from an animal, and from there they exclude lahotziat harovea van nirba. They exclude both an animal that initiated and an animal that happened to. So those two are two sides of the same, right? Like two sides of a coin. They go together. If you have rovea as a disqualification, then you have nirba. But if you don't have it, like in a bird where there is no rovea, then maybe there's no nearby disqualification. You say, look, something disgusting happened to this animal. A sin was occurred with it. It's going to be a problem. Let's learn from here. Now remember what he said. Why? I told you to remember this because it's not parallel in birds, right? So now they're going to say, if nirba was okay with birds, then you would say nirba is also not a disqualification that we would have to take it down because it's also kosher in birds. So what do you see from here? Shema mina, that's not kosher in birds. Otherwise, he would have added it to his list. We can also learn from here. It's a braita. Look at this list. It's all sorts of things that create tumah. The beta blia kind of tumah that we've talked about. And what's on this list? Nirba. So you see it's in a list of all these disqualifications of birds, so obviously it's disqualification. Okay. Rabbi Chanina Skana Kohanim, my Kamash Balam, what's he teaching us? Now what happened? We said, the Tanakama said Balmum is a problem. Imalu, you're due. Rabbi Kiva said, leave it on. If it's Dugan, right now we explained this Dugan Shabbayin. Rabbi Chanina Skana Kohanim said, my father used to push off the animals, I remember. So my Kamashman, what's he coming to teach us? Two possibilities. He's just trying to say people acted upon this, okay? And proving Tanakama. Or maybe the focus on what he said is he would push them off. What is push them off? Like in a very side way, not like take the animal, throw him off. He would push it to the side, like do it in a respectful manner, not to like say this animal is no good at all, because in the end it was an animal that was sanctified, just had a problem, so he would push it off very gently. Kashem she'im ala lo yired. Now the Mishnah said, also im yired lo ya. If it goes off though, after it was already on and kind of accepted by the altar, if it falls off or someone takes it off, we don't put it back on. Now Ula is going to modify this. Amar Ula, lo shanu ela shalom ashla behena ol. This is only if it didn't start being consumed by the fire. Aval mashla behena, or if the fire already started consuming it and then it fell off, ya'alu, we put it back on. Because at that point it was not only, lachmosh hamizbech, it was really, right, burning on the altar, we put it back on. Rav Meri, Matnei HaReisha, talked about different versions, so he had a version that it was on that line. Rav Chanina Misura Matnei HaSeifa, he actually said, Ula said it on the next Mishnah, which we'll see in a minute, but Hatzamot, Vagidim, Vakarnayim, Batzlafayim, Bizman Shemechubarim Ya'alu, Pershu Lo Ya'alu. All these parts of the body, like bones and sinews and horns and claws, these things are not supposed to go on the altar. But if they're attached to the animal, they go on with the animal. If they're detached, they don't go on. Now, on this, Amar Ula, Lo Shanu Ela Shalom Ashla Ben Ul. This is only if they fell off, let's say they were on and then they fell off, that's only if, you don't put them back on if they're detached, but only if the fire didn't consume it yet. Avam Ashla Ben or Ya'alu. Now, if we take Ula on that one or Ula on this one, so what would we say? Could we infer one from the other? Now, if you had it on this next Mishnah, then you would definitely say the same thing would hold true for our Mishnah. If you had it on the Reisha, now the Reisha is all these cases where they were supposed to go on the altar, but then they got disqualified for some reason. But they're things that are supposed to in general be on the altar. But you wouldn't necessarily say the same thing for parts of the body that were never supposed to be on the altar in the first place. So then he wouldn't necessarily say it, Ula wouldn't say it on the second one, that if the fire got to it, you would put it back on, because they're not even supposed to go on the altar. Okay, we'll finish quickly with the next Mishnah. Elu imalu yirdu. Now we have a list of things that if they go on, they come off, and that's because these were never meant to be on the altar, like the bones and things like that. But also, we're going to start with things that are supposed to be eaten, like the basar koche kodeshim, the meat of the koche kodeshim, which the kohanim are supposed to eat. Basar kochim kalim, which the owners eat, the meat of the kochim kalim. Motara omer, the remainder of the omer mincha offering, which goes to the kohanim. Shtei alechem and lechem apanim. Shtei alechem offering on Shavuot and the lechem apanim, the showbread every week, those go to the kohanim. Sheirei minchot, the remainders of the mincha, which go to the kohanim. The ketoret is the one thing that doesn't get eaten, but the ketoret, the incense, isn't supposed to be burned there. Hatzemer shebarashek fasim v'se'ar shebiskana tayashim. Okay, now we're going to get to all parts of the body that were never supposed to go on the altar in the first place. The wool on the kfasim, on the sheep, the hair on the goats, right, which they use for all sorts of things. Atzamot, bones, gidim, sinews, karnaim, horns, tlafayim, claws. Bizman shehem mechubarim, all these things, these parts of the body of the parts of the animal, Lo, bisman she'em mechubarim ya'alu, if they're attached, they go on. Shene'emal v'yiktira kohen et hakol. There's this 2 psukim. One is the kohen's supposed to sacrifice everything. Pirshu lo ya'alu. Shene'emar v'asita olotecha basar b'adam. But there's another pasuk that says only the meat and the blood. So now they say, how do we resolve these two? Well, if they separated, they don't go on. But if they're attached, they go on. And then tir hakol. Okay, with that, we finished for today. So we summarized the first part. The second part was just a bunch of sugyot. One was Rabbi Yochanan asking maybe a similar question to Ula, or maybe a completely, with the perspective on the me'ila, not on the imalu yerdu, right? Do you take it off or not? But anyway, coming to the same conclusion anyway as Rish Lakish, and just adding the issue about the me'ila. There is no me'ila. And then we talked about the Rabbi Yochanan, the Dugan Shabbai. Rabbi Yochanan was the main one who said that about him. And from there we got to Rabbi Uriah's question about the nirba, and kind of confirmed the answer from learned the answer from Rabbi Akiva. We had Rabbi Chinias Kana Kohanim, what was the purpose of his line, and then this issue of Ula, which said, well, you don't put them back on if they came off, but if already the fire was consuming them, then you do. Which Mishnah was he talking about, this one or the upcoming one? And with that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day.